The U.S. Merchant of Death in Capitalism's Great Race to the Bottom by Danny Haifong, BAR contributor, editor, 26th of February 2020. So this is from the blackagendareport.com. The U.S. is world's merchant of death in a capitalism's race to the bottom. The U.S.-led arms trade and the Great Race to the Bottom are interconnected phenomena that cannot be fought separately. Empire is the engine that drives the political economy of the United States. The U.S. empire, like all capitalist states, has as its sole purpose the maintenance of class exploitation. While few on any part of the U.S. political spectrum are willing to say the word, empire is a key concern for a ruling class that is committed to preserving the economic and political supremacy of capitalism in its late and terminal stages. Over the last 40 years, U.S. capitalists have transformed the military apparatus into one of its largest and most profitable industries in the world. The U.S. State Department's recently released World Military Expenditures and Arms Transfer report lays bare the extent to which the U.S. capitalist economy has become a merchant of death in the Great Race to the Bottom. According to the report, the United States comprises of nearly 80% of the world's $3 trillion arms trade. U.S. military contractors and arms manufacturers export 4 times the number of weapons than the next 9 countries in the world combined. Much of the arms trade is confined to what the report calls the, quote, richest and most democratic, end quote, quintile of the global population. This is a euphemism for the imperialist orbit led by the US, Europe, and its compliant allies. These countries make up 90% of all arms exports and over 60% of all imports. In other words, rich nations loyal to the United States hold a monopoly on both sides of the sale of weapons designed for mass murder and war. It should come as no surprise that the arms industry is concentrated in the United States. The State Department report demonstrates that the arms industry is driven not only by the profit motive, but also by U.S. reliance on a massive military apparatus to make the world safe for capitalist exploitation. Military expenditures have become even more important under late-stage capitalism. Late-stage capitalism is characterized by a great race to the bottom for nearly half of the world's population. Capitalist economic growth has remained stagnant since the 2007-2008 economic crisis, yet wealth continues to trickle into the hands of just a few thousand ultra-rich billionaires. The U.S. ascendancy as the world's merchant of death is primarily driven by the need to protect the benefactors of the race to the bottom through endless war. It only makes sense under such a predatory system for the capitalist class to want to profit from its investments in endless war too. The Great Race to the Bottom has disrupted what was once a key pillar in the stability of U.S. imperialism, that is, the uneven development of the capitalist West and the Third World. Austerity rapidly eviscerating the material privileges once afforded to a section of mainly white workers in the United States. A new survey from Salary Finance found that 32% of all people in the United States are unable to cover their needs between paychecks. While the poorest workers face this situation at least 40% of the time, high-income earners making more than $100,000 also run out of cash by the next pay period at an average rate of 30%. The data complements a 2019 survey which found that nearly 80% of workers in the United States live paycheck to paycheck. The reasons for the growing poverty of workers living in supposedly the most exceptional, in quotes, society on the planet are not difficult to discern. Median wages have declined by 9% since 2006 when adjusted for inflation. Medical costs have risen 4% over the last year. Housing costs have risen 3%, while food prices have increased by 2%. Meanwhile, real wages increased by just 0.2% over the same period. Stagnant wages and rising costs have led to the astronomical accumulation of household debt. US-based workers owe $930 billion in credit card debt and over $1 trillion in student loan debt. For decades, anti-war activists have paraphrased Tupac Shakur's lyric, quote, "They have money, but can't feed the poor," end quote, to highlight how all working people stand to lose from the massive growth of the US war machine. The logic is simple enough. Bloated war. Now I'm going to stop here and say, please learn about MMT, modern monetary theory. Dr. Stephanie Kelton is the economic advisor for Bernie Sanders, Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont in the US, and she is a proponent of MMT, and MMT is simply a description of the operational reality of a sovereign economy. So the next sentence has some economically illiterate problems, and we need to understand that federal taxes do not fund spending, and also that in a sovereign economy, the economy can afford both those awful wars and it can afford Medicare for all because the US is a currency issuer. And so it's important for us to understand modern monetary theory, the operational reality of a sovereign economy, so we don't put out this myth that we need to tax the rich to be able to afford social programs. That's not the case, even though it's important to tax the rich for equity reasons and ethical reasons. So we need to understand that these federal taxes do not fund these wars and they do not fund social programs. So if somebody says to you, oh, I don't want to have my federal taxes paying for those asylum seekers, you can say to them, when you understand MMT, that your federal taxes do not pay for these social programs for those asylum seekers. So it actually takes away some of these racist things. Well, they'll still probably be racist, but these racist things people say, or if they're trying to stomp on the poor, I don't want my taxes paying for those homeless people and such. Well, that's actually not how it happens in a sovereign economy. So that's why it's important to understand MMT. So I'm just going to continue on now with this article. The logic is simple enough. Bloated war spending takes money away from housing, education, healthcare, and other infrastructure needs that would directly benefit the poor and working people. The slogan should thus be more popular than it is. A huge impediment to this level of anti-war consciousness is that the US Great Race to the Bottom rests on the foundations of a patently racist and imperialist social order. There are many in the US, even on the left, who have yet to grasp the importance of standing against the US imperial war machine and instead find themselves complicit in the chauvinist and racist predations of the empire. The effectiveness of the late-stage capitalism resides in the ability to mitigate its many simmering crises by channeling left politics into the Democratic side of the war party. In the 2020 Democratic Party primary, little attention has been paid to the US war machine, despite the impediment that the trillion-dollar military budget poses to implementing popular policies such as Medicare for All and a Green New Deal. Now, I've just explained what the problems are with that statement earlier on. The Democratic Party has enthusiastically assumed the position of vanguard for the empire's continued demonization campaign against Russia, China, Venezuela, and other nations targeted for regime change. Workers are led to believe that no matter how bad conditions become on the mainland, their living standards will remain higher than those which exist in nations where US meddling is predominant. The disproportionately black, incarcerated, and homeless populations receive the same treatment domestically as the dehumanized subjects of empire abroad. That is, as disposable populations useless to the imperatives of capital. The US must find concrete ways to address the material reality embedded in the racist and imperialist dogma of American exceptionalism, mass incarceration, draconian surveillance, and endless war, are all designed to sow fear and reinforce a false sense of comfort in the working class. Blame for the deplorable conditions that exist for all working class people have been channeled into a fear of the, quote, other, end quote, whether it is a fear of immigrant populations, black Americans, or Russians. Such blame allows for questions of uneven economic and political development in black America and the rest of the world to be rendered secondary to the broader, quote, national security, end quote, interests of the United States. The Great Race to the Bottom thrives on an atmosphere of war that can be elevated to toxic levels in a moment's notice, should the balances of forces require it. The moment is now. The Great Race to the Bottom is not just a disaster for the bottom of the imperialist pecking order. Late-stage capitalism presents its own set of catastrophic contradictions for the rulers of the empire. The principal contradiction is the inability of imperialism to provide tangible benefits to any section of the people except the tiny few in command of the state. Concern among the ruling class is growing among the resurgence of social welfare politics exemplified by the Yellow Vests in France and Bernie Sanders in the United States. Even more of a concern for US imperialism is the rapid growth of China as the world's foremost economic superpower. China's Belt and Road Initiative seeks to spread its successful fight against poverty and underdevelopment by using trillions of state-owned dollars earmarked for infrastructure projects with Global South nations. While domestic unrest around the deplorable conditions of late-stage capitalism increases the possibility for class struggle in the United States, China's rise threatens to accelerate the United States' already shrinking share of the global capitalist economy. The US-led arms trade and the Great Race to the Bottom are interconnected phenomena which cannot be fought separately. A dire need exists to counter the racist and imperialist ideology that mystifies the connection between the economic crisis of late-stage capitalism and the empire's reliance upon endless war to keep its sinking boat afloat. This is no easy task. Black politics remains captive in the ideological prison of the Democratic Party, and the anti-war movement has yet to penetrate the growing forces gathering behind Bernie Sanders. As the popularity of socialistic politics of the reformist variety continues to grow, anyone and everyone who considers themselves the left, in quotes, should be simultaneously spreading the message that socialism without peace is not socialism at all, only a dream for a more comfortable existence under empire that leaves the rest of humanity behind.